Miss Caroline van der Sluys,
Ya.
dengan topik Lessons Learned from 10 Years of Support to ASEA Indonesia.
Okay.
Pengalaman 10 tahun di Indonesia.
Terima
Kami
kasih,
persilakan,
ya.
please.
Terima kasih.
About 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. That's about 2 minutes per year, so that's not much time. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Yes. Yeah, I'd like to talk about 3 things basically. I'm going to take us a little bit down to the basics here, looking a little bit more at the details of what we've been doing. So I'll be giving a short summary of what actually the 3 environment sector programs have been doing to support SCA in the country, and some of the key lessons from a very practical perspective, I think, and then what are the implications for this. Now, this is a chart that shows a little bit, it's not so clear, but basically our focus has been through over 3 periods of support from 2006 up until the end of next year, 2018, ESP 1, 2, and 3. As Kurt already mentioned, we've had a total of about 100 billion Indonesian rupiah invested in this by the time we end, which is not an insignificant amount of money from Danish taxpayers. And there's been, in all 3 programs, there's been sort of 3 thematic areas that we've supported. Now that's been this whole policy guidance and regulatory support, and I have a diagram of that later. I think there's been quite a lot of regulations and SEA guidance documents, screening documents that have come out. A lot of them have come out with the support from the DANITA program. Then we've done a lot of capacity development, the second thematic area here. And then, of course, we've done, which probably has been the bulk of the investment, has been the actual implementations of SEAs and facilitating the process of doing studies. So the ESP2 focus was primarily, I would say, on developing tools and guidance, and more on that institutional instrument level, and a lot of extensive, comprehensive capacity development, awareness building, sort of what is SEA, where do we want to go with this? And then we actually did 29 practical implementations, what we call pilot studies, so that's quite a lot, and there's a breakdown there of what they were. ESP3, during the formulation of that, which I was involved in actually, we thought that, well, now is the time, now we have capacity, now is the time to start seeing results on the ground. So all this stuff about, we've got the tools, we've got the instruments, let's see we want to see change on the ground. We want to see sustainable development. So we're ready for that now, we thought. So we focused a lot more, we continued to focus on guidance because the institutions were changing, obviously. You had the joining of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry is one example. We were planning to do less capacity development, and we would continue with the SEA studies. So, if this is the overall sort of framework of the legislation, you see the 3 laws in place. You see the pink is the guidelines that were in place that have been developed, and then you've got the more recent regulations on sustainable development goals, etc. So in this framework, you can see that we had ESP1 here between 2006 and 7. We had ESP2 coming in between 12 to 18. And now we have ESP3. So obviously, there's been, we'd like to think that there's been a little bit of an impact here, that we've had some impact on all these pink boxes, which I think we did. And at the top, you see what I tried to do is to graph, this is the evolution of the studies that were implemented on the ground. So you can see that, obviously, increasingly, there's been more and more studies happening. So we're getting a lot of evidence-based information on what's working and what's not working, what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses. And I tried to think a little bit about what I call the evolution of SCA. It's a little bit different from Ibu Yanti's, but from our perspective, I think up until about 2006-07, we would call that the early beginnings. There's not so much awareness. It's a lot externally driven, but beginning to be more internally driven. I think decentralization played a very, very important role, but I think that there was, fair to say, probably a lot of external pressure for this. And then we have the development phase, which we were very much involved with, tools, instruments, legal framework, et cetera, and maybe we're at consolidation now. So this is Total studies, this includes all the studies, and I think I have 106. I collected 106 studies and looked at most of them, and I think there's actually more. I'm probably missing about 25 or 30, but the bulk of them have been done in Java and Sumatra, and then much less in the eastern part of the country. And, the first one was the types of studies. So most of them have been done on spatial plans, quite a few on the RPJMDs, and then you see that I think what I consider maybe some of the more interesting ones, the policy and program at the national level, there's not been a whole lot done on that yet, but that will hopefully come in the future. This is not relevant. And we've got mappings here, but I think we'll just go quickly through it. Basically what I've done is I've taken this database and I've mapped it in the country, so we can see a distribution here of where the studies have been. And it's not very clear here, so we'll just skip through it. There's not a lot of time, too, since I only have 2 minutes per year. And here, so the general situation today, if I look at this, all the studies I've looked at and the various lessons learned reports, of which we have many, there's well over 100 studies. Overall, there's definitely an improving quality in the studies. There's no doubt about that, significantly improving quality. There's more consistent and structured methodology. Not yet international standards, and I would say perhaps not yet local best practice standards that were defined in 2014, but there's also, I mean, it's definitely improving, and there's a growing number of SEA practitioners, and a number of very high profile SEA examples in Indonesia, a bit like the Mekong that Kuat mentioned. The problem is that we're not very good yet at measuring outcomes of the SEAs. So if we want to see whether we're improving sustainable development on the ground, I have to say we don't know that. And we as a donor would like to know that by the end of next year if we've accomplished something, but what's going on here? I think there's some automatic timing. And I think that, I think it's fair to say that the very significant, consistent, and I think flexible Danish support has played a central role in the evolution of SEA so far in the country. Now, I've used a lot of different sources for the upcoming discussion, and I won't go through all of them, but I did also administer a questionnaire to 6 or 7 of our key partners with 13 very specific questions of a more political nature to ask them about what they thought SEA, how it was functioning on the ground in Indonesia today. Now, I have a grouping of different types of lessons learned, and it's moving by itself. Okay, with respect to how we provided our technical assistance, what I would call the modalities. I give up. Gimana? Yeah? Okay, so sorry about that. During the course of the 3 phases of support, okay, but I'll keep speaking, and then if we fix it, that would be great, and if not, well, you know.
Okay. You can try.
Okay, good. Can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you. Okay, so we've tested a number of different modalities for our technical support to SEA. And the ASP2 program, we had a very heavy reliance on local technical consultants to provide support to the actual implementation of studies, 60 plus contracts actually, and international support was provided on more of the technical, the policy, regulatory, and guidance side of things. So SEA more international, more national level, local more at the implementation level. And we focused primarily on the early stages of SEA preparation, so scoping, pre-scoping, a lot of workshops and meetings, etc. And then this eventually evolved into the practical pilot implementations in the field using primarily local consultants. The pros of this model was that there was a good development of local SEA consulting capacity, I think that we saw quite a lot of evolution in the capacity of local consultants, which was excellent. The cons was that there was a very low impact on actual in-house capacity to implement SCA, particularly at local government level. So it was very much, you could say, a consultant-driven process, I think. And there was a lot of consultants running around, 60 plus contracts. So you could question the absorptive capacity of that by the partners. Next. ESP2 and end of 2 and 3, we shifted the model towards something that was more of a combined local and international technical assistance implementation for SEA studies, with consultants acting a lot more as facilitators, learning by doing approach, providing input at the crucial steps in the SEAs, but not necessarily doing the full SEAs, or at least not in all cases. And this model functioned very well. There was a lot of work directly providing support to the SEA task forces in the local government levels. This model worked very well, developed a lot of capacity, and I think it was quite appreciated by our local partners if I look at the lessons learned and the studies that were done to evaluate this. Now, the problem is that a lot of these local SEA task forces are still very much evolving, and working with them is it's not always the same. Some have very strong SEA task forces and some local governments do not have very strong ones, so it depends on the profile of the particular local government. And I think that the lesson for us has been that a model of mixed environmental and local SEA, two locally embedded teams in the local governments, is really the best model for sort of building capacity for SEA, particularly at local government level. Next. In terms of capacity and overall awareness, I think there's everywhere I read that there's limited capacity to do SEA, but we've been doing capacity support for 10 years, so we can't be that limited, to be honest. And as the quote says, I think that it's not rocket science, it's not that difficult. So I think that yes, there is some limited technical capacity, but there's a lot of other capacities. There's strategic thinking skills, there's analytical skills, which is technical, but there's also facilitation skills. It's very, very important if we talk about SCA. If we want to influence policy, we need to have facilitation skills and advocacy skills to convince people to think in a different way. So all of this is a bit thinking outside the box. So it's a new kind of set of skills that are needed. And obviously the people we want to influence, the policymakers, planners, the high-level decision makers, they need to understand SCA, and they certainly need to understand the opportunities that it provides. So they also need this awareness. So SCA has to be effective. You have a whole range of different skills, some that we don't necessarily associate with traditional capacity development, right? Traditional training. Next. Okay, so as I mentioned in ESP3, we were hoping to focus a lot less on capacity development, but what happened is that suddenly there was a new combined ministry, there was many staff changes, there was lots of rotation, so there was basically a need to start all over again, so to sort of continue with capacity. And I think the lesson for me and has been that if we talk about SCA training and capacity, it's not a finite process. It will continue forever. And it will also need to evolve and develop as SEA implementation experience develops. So as we change how we do SEAs, as we get better at it, we'll need a different set of skills, obviously. So this is going to be a continuous process, and it will be a huge task. And the challenge is to be fit to figure out how to best do that in the coming years, hopefully with the support of some other donors, since we'll be leaving. Next. Trainer and Trainers is one of the programs that we've been involved with in the past 2 years, I guess. And I think that that is a very interesting program. The Trainer programs, for people who are not familiar with it, is where we're working on training groups of trainers associated with the environmental research centers. And the idea is really to build a critical mass of SEA practitioners. And I think it's a very good approach. And I think it can certainly help to address the often repeated complaint that there's lack of local expertise in SEA. This will help to fill that gap. And what I thought was interesting when I read the training reports was that they talk about two SEA approaches in the training. They talk about the impact-based and the strategic thinking-based approach. And interestingly enough, there's been a lot of interest on the part of the participants in the strategic thinking training. And I think this is a really good opportunity to sort of expand on this type of capacity development, which is a bit different from the more traditional technical, what is an SEA and what is an impact, et cetera. Because it's you know, how do you think strategically, how do you influence decision makers, et cetera. And of course, the very interesting networking capacity development link is important. Next. I think that we'll skip the first one. The second one, in terms of the steps in the SEA process, I think that the preliminary steps in the process, if I look at all of the studies and the lessons learned that we've done, the preliminary steps in the process, and I mean the pre-scoping, the terms of reference for the studies, and the scoping is really, really critical to get the key strategic issues in place before you start to go into doing a 1,000-page document. Literally, I mean, a lot of the documents I've looked at are 600 or 700 pages. It's a lot of stuff in there. But I think in the case of the scoping, we have one example where it was in the case of the palm oil, the SEA for the palm oil that we did with Bapinas, where there was a very broad stakeholder involvement at the initial phase, and there was, I think, 41 strategic issues that were put on the table. And it was, the stakeholders involved government people, but they also involved private sector people, the Association of Indonesian Palm Oil, whatever they're called, and there's 2 different associations, and then a lot of some NGOs as well. And that was focused down to 10 strategic issues. And this was a very interesting process in how you get different groups of people around the table to identify key strategic issues. And but I mean, one of the things we learned about this is that it's time consuming, and you need some funds to do that. And you need very good facilitation skills. You need good facilitators to manage a process like this. Next. Data, very, very problematic. Continuing issue everywhere. All the studies I've looked at, there's a problem with data. This is true for all sectors, not just for environment, but I think there's particular problems with environmental data. If I look at how enthusiastic the government was with the database that was developed for the SEA of the MP3EI, which is the master plan for Indonesia, I think there'll be some discussions, I'm not sure if there will be, but they developed a very large database, the consultants, as part of this study. And there's been a lot of enthusiasm for that. And it just highlights the point that it's difficult to find data. And I think that one of the ideas would be interesting in the future is if there's other donors that are providing support, or even the Indonesian government providing support to SEAs, that you should think about developing databases with the study and then make those available and freely available and shared with other people. Next. Scenario development, impact evaluation, mitigation, limited scenario development, I can see from the studies I looked at. Quite limited, there's a few exceptions. I think Kendeng is one, which we'll probably hear about this afternoon and tomorrow. That's where there's actually some interesting scenario development. There's been a few others, but generally it's not commonly seen in the SEA reports that we have now. Impact evaluation is maybe improving. It used to be very qualitative, very descriptive, and I think it's moving much more to be more analytic and systematic. But it still could be much improved, I would say. And one of the suggestions that came out of a study that we financed to look at the different guidelines in Indonesia, the 5 guidelines, was that it could be a good idea to have a very explicit impact evaluation framework that might help to provide some guidance, because it's obvious that people need guidance in this respect. And then one of the interesting things that came out of some of the studies we supported in Central Java, I think it was, is that the use of visualizations, visual information is very, very effective to get the idea of impacts across to people, especially decision makers and planners that aren't very technical people. Next. Recommendations are the core of SEA. And the problem is that they're often not properly linked to strategic issues. The other problem is that a recommendation should be clear, it should use unambiguous, very clear language, it should be simple, and it should be easy to understand. And I've looked at some of the studies where you have 10 pages of recommendations with very long text, and it's very difficult to understand a lot of these recommendations. And a decision maker, it has to be easy to understand and strategic, or a decision maker won't even bother reading it. So this is a real issue, and if we talk about the terms of the quality of the reports, I think that a good focus on getting much better at doing the recommendations. And again, that could be included in the guideline discussion, the upcoming guideline discussion. Next. User report structure and friendliness. A report has to be, I mean, it shouldn't be, well, it can be 1,000 pages long, but then it needs an executive summary. And many of them don't have that. So I've opened reports that are just literally, you know, really long, and you just give up because you just can't see what the critical issues are. And I think it's really important to make it user-friendly, especially for the decision makers, and good to have all the information about who actually did the report, so there's a little bit of accountability there. Next. Stakeholder participation and dialogue. I'm just reading a comment from one of the lessons learned studies that we financed in 2017. Engagement of relevant stakeholders in all pilot locations is deemed not optimal, and the composition of stakeholder groups can be improved so that all groups can provide significant contributions. Now this was done, she's probably sitting in this room, done by one of the local consultants that we work a lot with. And obviously stakeholder participation improves SEA quality and it increases the likelihood of success. It's very important. And so adequate provision for dialogue is essential, and I think also proper feedback mechanisms to stakeholders so that they can follow the process once they've been involved in the beginning. Next. Public participation, which I separate from stakeholder because I think it's a little bit different. Early SEAs had very limited public community participation and consultation, and I think one of the issues here, and it's also come from from all of the respondents that I spoke to, the questionnaires, is that the complexity of some SEAs can make it effective public consultation quite difficult. So, but nonetheless, I still think that opening up the SEA process to public scrutiny is very, very important for the credibility of the process. The public should have easy access to SEA reports. They should be able to find them when they want them, and they should be able to follow the results of the process. And they also need to see that the process is having an impact. Else, what's the point of doing it, right? And from what I can see from the studies of the lessons learned that we've done and the respondents, and that there's a consensus that this aspect needs to be further strengthened and improved. Next. Quality assurance and implementation monitoring. The SEA reports generally don't have, at this point in time, a lot of what I call impact monitoring. So you get the whole report, you get the recommendations, you read about how the recommendations need to be integrated into the local planning, the RPGMDs, the spatial plans, but then what happens after that? And as a donor, next year when we leave, we would really like to know what's happened on the ground. Have these recommendations been implemented? What has been the impact of a lot of these SEAs? And that is, at this time, very, very difficult to see. I would say impossible to see generally. So it needs to be, outcome and impact monitoring needs to be integrated into the studies in a much better way than it is now. And I think that there's another interesting development in the last year, and that is that there's a lot more focus on the Sustainable Development Goals monitoring. You have a new perpres, no, on SDGs that talks about how local governments are going to have to do a lot more concrete monitoring of the SDGs. And I think this provides an opportunity how you can link SDG monitoring, Sustainable Development Goal monitoring, with SEA report and impact monitoring. So killing two birds with one stone, you could say.
Can you do it in 3 minutes?
What? Yeah.
3 more minutes, okay.
Yeah, no problem. It's almost done. Next. Was that decision? Back one? Sorry. Thank you. Okay. Integration into planning and influence on decision making. This is this is my second to last slide. And I think everybody has mentioned that. Kurt has mentioned that. Ibu Siti has mentioned that. SEA nothing will happen if it's not integrated and it's not implemented, obviously. And it's very difficult still, I think, to see the recommendations being fully integrated into decision making. There's been some discussion that this is a regulatory issue, that you can make a regulation to ensure that this happens. Yes, you can, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think that there's a number of issues that determine the extent to which something will be integrated into the planning process, and to the extent to which a high-level decision maker will even care about an SCA. And the first is obviously the ownership and commitment to the SCA principles. And this means that it's got to be based on a willingness and a commitment to the process. And when I asked the respondents why people do SCAs, the answer was always dasar hukum, because it's in the law. And yes, it's in the law, but it has to be more than that. There has to be a commitment to it. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. And so I think willingness and understanding of the benefits and the opportunities is really, really crucial. And obviously this means that high-level decision makers really need to understand, and their commitment is critical. So they need to see it as an opportunity and not as a threat. And this is a long-term process. Next. Okay, timing, again, very, very important in integration into decision making. If you start an SCA after the plan is made, then your possibility of having an impact is minimal. So obviously you need to start well in advance, or at least at the same time. And it's generally too little too late right now, unfortunately. So it's very important. Again, if we talk about integration, the extent and range of stakeholders involved from the very beginning is crucial, again. The other thing I think is how, in the case of the task forces or the local SCA teams, how do they talk to policy and planners and policymakers? How are they linked together? What is the connection between the POCJA and the DPRD? How do they communicate together? And I was interested to see that in one of the lessons learned, it said very clearly, there's a lack of communication with planners and decision makers. So you have a technical team doing a technical work, and they're not talking to the decision makers, or not always talking. And to me, that's the most important thing. You start talking to them maybe even before you start collecting your data, right? So SCA practitioners need to learn how to talk to planners, and they need to have a very solid understanding of the planning and policy development process. So this is, again, a different set of skills that aren't necessarily scientific technical. Next. Okay, this is the second to last slide, and just a summary of, I had 13 questions that I asked our key partners over the last 10 years, people we've known and been working very closely with, Indonesian partners. And this is a summary of the responses. So the driving force, according to our partners, is still very much legal requirement. That's why we do SCAs in Indonesia. It's because we have to. But there is a growing political commitment that came from one respondent. The benefits, it's interesting, they highlight that the benefits of SCA is particularly useful when there's a huge conflict. That's when people sort of pull the SCA out of the cupboard and start to talk about it. So the case of Jakarta Bay is one, and Kendeng is another one, and I'm sure that more and more will come up in the future. There's an agreement, a general consensus from everybody that responded that there's a need for better public participation and information exchange, but the recognition that this is challenging because of the complexity of some of the issues. And that the success factors for an SCA depend on A, political will. That was the first thing everybody said, political will. Second, effective stakeholder participation. Third, good quality SCAs that include scenario development early on in the process. Good data, very important. Clear recommendations and solid understanding of the planning process. Facilitation skills came up as an important issue from our Indonesian partners. And obviously good technical support is needed. And what's interesting is that the success depends on political will, but it's also a major challenge. The challenges were political will, understanding of the high-level decision makers about the SCA process so that they can make the right decision from the sustainable development perspective. So it's basically about changing the mindset of the higher-level decision makers. And then another challenge has been the low analytical skills. And I asked them to actually score the status of SCA in Indonesia at this point in time, based on what they thought the general commitment and willingness to use results of SCA, and the average score was 5.8 out of 10. So it means that there is still a little bit of a ways to go. Yeah. And then I have one last slide here that I think is interesting. There was a study that was done, financed by us, it was actually on looking at what they called SCA in the political culture of decision-making in Indonesia. And there's two quotes from that study that I thought are interesting for me as a more technical background person. One is that the quality of governance systems, i.e. transparency and accountability, the values of decision makers and stakeholders, their power relationships, and the acceptability of the policy trade-offs play a much more dominant role in decision-making than any technical advice. So it's very much a non-technical issue when we talk about decision-making, especially when it involves land. Land is expensive, especially spatial plans, I can imagine. And then the other thing that was quoted, which I thought was interesting, is that traditional methods of enforcement rapidly lose power as one moves towards more strategic levels of decision-making. So regulation doesn't work when we talk about decision-making. So it's a whole different way of looking at how we can advocate and influence our decision makers in this whole political process.
Time is up.
Thank you.
Oke, tepuk tangan. Terima kasih.